Welcome to St. Stephen's Episcopal Church. This is the 9th Sunday after Pentecost, and this sermon is based on the readings from Genesis chapter 32, verses 22 to 31, and the Gospel of Matthew chapter 14, verses 13 through 21. And we've been reading portions of the book of Genesis for our first lesson each week for the past several weeks, but I have not been preaching on the book of Genesis because I have been focusing on the parable stories from the Gospel of Matthew. So let's review the story of Genesis up to this point. First of all, remember that when God created the world, it was all very good. But things went wrong from the start. Sin entered the world. Adam and Eve were kicked out of the Garden of Eden. Cain murdered his brother Abel, and things continued to go downhill from there. So God attempted a great cosmic do-over with the great flood, destroying all of creation except a handful of people. But that failed to erase sin from the world, and it was a pretty harsh solution. So God promised never, ever to do that again. Instead, God chose one family to be especially blessed so that through them and through their descendants, the whole world would find blessing. So God chose Abraham and Sarah, called them from their home country near Babylon, and sent them to the country of the Jordan River, and promised that one day this land would belong to their descendants and that the whole world would be blessed through them. The problem was that Abraham and Sarah were quite old when the story began, and they were childless, but in their old age, they had a son Isaac, and God blessed him also. So Isaac married his relative Rebekah when he was 40, and Rebekah became pregnant with twins. Now for these two boys, sibling rivalry started very early. While they were still in their womb, they struggled with one another to the point that their mother complained, "If it is to be this way, why do I live?" When the boys were born, Esau came out first all hairy and red, while Jacob came out immediately following, grasping his brother's heel with his tiny hand. The name Jacob means something like he grabs by the heel, or he supplants, an indication of further struggles ahead in the lives of these two twins. And Esau became a skillful hunter and lived out in the fields, while Jacob liked living around in the tents. And Isaac loved Esau, while the boy's mother Rebekah loved Jacob. And when Isaac was old and his health and sight were failing, he called Esau in to receive the blessing that was due the eldest son. Isaac asked Esau to go out and kill some game and make a savory stew for him. But Rebekah, the mother, was listening in and plotted to give the blessing instead to Jacob. So she made a stew with a goat from the flock, and Jacob dressed himself up in furs so he would seem hairy like his brother. And Jacob brought the stew to his father, claiming to be Esau. Isaac, with his failing sight, wondered why Esau sounded so much like Jacob, and questioned how he could have returned so quickly from the hunt. But nevertheless, Isaac gave Jacob the blessing meant for the firstborn son, and Jacob stole his brother's birthright. When Esau returned from hunting, he found out that his birthright had been swindled from him, and he howled in anger. He swore to kill his brother, but Rebekah, still taking sides between these two warring brothers, sent Jacob away to her brother Laban's household for protection. It was while Jacob was living with his uncle Laban that he fell in love with his cousin Rachel, and then agreed to work for 7 years for his uncle in order to marry her. But Jacob the trickster was tricked instead by his uncle when Laban pulled a switch on him and gave Jacob his older cousin Leah to marry on their wedding night. When Jacob discovered the switch, he complained, Laban explained, and Jacob had to work another 7 years in order to marry Rachel, his wife's sister, who is also his cousin. Now the story is a little messy. Forget about marrying a first cousin. Marrying one's wife's sister is completely forbidden from the laws in the book of Leviticus. So the moral message of this part of the story is a little murky. But then Jacob goes on to outwit his uncle Laban as the story continues to unfold. As Jacob continues to tend his uncle's flocks, he uses trickery and magic to expand his herds at the expense of Laban's. When Laban finally gets wind of what is happening, he is furious, so Jacob flees with his wives, his children, his flocks, and some stolen household goods. Laban finally catches up with Jacob, and eventually they make peace, but Jacob, they decide, can no longer live in this country. So Jacob has to return to his home country, and his brother Esau is still, no doubt, seeking revenge for Jacob having stolen his birthright. In order to soften up his brother Esau, Jacob sends messengers ahead of him with gifts for his brother, who in return with the news that Esau is coming along to meet him with 400 armed men. This does not have the appearance of a happy reunion between these two brothers. And that brings us finally to today's story. Jacob prays to God for deliverance from Esau's wrath and sends his wives, children, flocks, all his ill-gotten wealth ahead of him. And then, physically exhausted and deeply anxious about his reunion with Esau, alone in the isolated wilderness, shorn of all his worldly possessions, at long last powerless to control his fate, Jacob collapses into a deep sleep on the banks of the river Jabbok. With Laban behind him and his brother Esau ahead of him, he is too spent to struggle any longer. Darkness descends. And then Jacob's real struggles begin. Fleeing from his family history had been difficult enough. Wrestling with God himself was a different matter altogether. That long and lonely night, a stranger visited Jacob. They wrestled through the night hours until daybreak. Now the story is deliberately ambiguous as to whom Jacob wrestled that night. Was it God? Was it an angel? A demon of the night? His own fears? His own guilty subconscious self? Whoever it was, they wrestled all night, and Jacob was holding his own in the wrestling match when his hip was put out of joint. Jacob held the stranger in a pin and demanded a blessing from him. Instead, Jacob received a new name, and he walked away from the encounter with a wounded hip. By then, Jacob knew what had happened, declaring, "I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." When it was over, Jacob the trickster, Jacob the heel grabber, Jacob the usurper received a new name. The strange man gave Jacob the name Israel, which means he struggles with God. Most important of all, at the conclusion of that wrestling match, God just blessed this deceiver who struggled with his anxieties in the dark. Now, the strange story of Jacob the wrestler is paired this weekend with a very familiar story about the feeding of the 5,000. This feeding story is familiar to us partly because it is one of the few stories that is told in all four gospel accounts, even though each gospel account tells the story in a slightly different way, emphasizing different aspects of the story. So I won't retell the story, but I want to lift up three key points in Matthew's version. First of all, Jesus was motivated by compassion in this feeding miracle. Jesus saw the needs of the great crowd that had gathered for health, for safety, for truth, for nourishment, for peace of mind, and he fed them and he healed them. Secondly, Jesus instructed the disciples that they themselves should feed the hungry people. The disciples came to Jesus suggesting that he send the people away to go forage for themselves, but Jesus told the disciples to feed the people even though the disciples had barely enough food to feed themselves. And finally, this story challenges our fears and misunderstandings about the notion of scarcity. We are convinced that there is never enough stuff to go around. There's never enough time, never enough money, never enough people, never enough energy or love or compassion to respond to all the needs and problems in this world. But when we offer to God the little bit we have, God blesses it and becomes enough to feed, clothe, and transform us and those in need. Like Jacob, finally alone at the river Jabbok, after releasing all his ill-gotten wealth, God takes us, blesses us, and gives us in service to the world, sometimes leaving us limping from our experience and encounter. Jesus says to the disciples in this story with regard to the large, hungry crowd, don't send them away. You feed them. You clothe them. You house them. You welcome them. You love them. So Jesus does not issue a policy statement. Jesus was not a politician or a government strategist. Jesus says simply to us, you figure it out. God does not erect barriers. God seeks justice for every person, and Jesus stands on the side of compassion. Jesus stands on the side of the oppressed. And Jesus promises that when we open our hearts and share our resources, we will experience abundance beyond our wildest dreams. Not the sort of abundance that delivers us a new car or a bigger house or the sweepstakes prize, but abundance of life for all God's children, as imperfect as we are. And speaking of imperfection, the strange story of Jacob reminds us that God calls even those who are very imperfect to accomplish God's saving work in our world. Jacob the trickster is nobody's example of moral perfection, but God blessed Jacob and all his offspring to bring blessing to the whole world. As a result of the blessing match, God gave Jacob a new name, Israel, the one who wrestled with God, the one who wrestled with humans and survived. With this new name, Jacob enters a new future and passes on his name, his faith, and his blessing to all his descendants and to the whole world. When we stop and consider the things we have done and left undone, and we face the consequences for our actions and our decisions, there is probably much for us to be anxious about. We might not have nearly as much to atone for as Jacob did, but we may find ourselves wrestling with God and with our consciences and with our own selves. Our world is in crisis. The world cries out for healing and for the end of poverty and oppression. Ending the structures of racism and oppression require change deeper than most of us can endure. Changes within ourselves, changes in our world around us, changes in the way our world functions. It seems impossible to imagine that God's kingdom of justice and peace is visible and present among us. It may seem impossible that God can call imperfect people such as ourselves to be a blessing in our world. We cannot avoid those things that cause us anxiety. Our scriptures call us to confront the struggles, the poverty, the racial injustice, and all that make people cry out in our world. Our scriptures call us to be a community where we do not lose heart in the midst of injustice, oppression, and change. Our scriptures tell us to offer to God the little bit we have, so that God will bless it to become enough to feed, clothe, transform us and our world. Our scriptures call us, imperfect as we are, to be a source of blessing in our imperfect world. Thanks be to God.